Creating good-looking glass in Eevee is pretty challenging, because unlike with cycles, you don't get all of those nice rays of light bouncing around, so everything's a little bit faked. And that leads to some weird results, as you can see here with this glass Bsdf. This is the kind of result that you're going to get by default out of Eevee. With a combination of just the right tricks and just the right settings though, we can make a shader that looks much better. I'm Jonathan Lampel with cgcookie.com, and in this video I want to break down how this shader is made and what's inside the guts of it, as well as all of the material settings that need to be in place in order for this to work. First, let's look at the problems with the normal glass Bsdf and how this solves them. You'll notice with the glass Bsdf that things are distorted a little bit too much for the object. That's because Eevee assumes that the object is just a complete solid, so whether there's a hole in it or whether there's space in between different parts, it just thinks it's one giant solid object. So even though this bowl shouldn't be refracting things that much because there's only just two thin sides of it, it assumes that it's just one big solid manifold object. And so we'd actually need to turn down the IOR quite a bit, or set a refraction depth to be something pretty small. The problem with setting a refraction depth though, you can see that this does work. We maybe need to turn it up a little bit. But the problem with this is that we can't set it differently per material, even though it's a material setting. And maybe that's a bug, I'm not entirely sure. But if you try to make another material, it'll just copy the original material's refraction depth, which is kind of weird. So we actually need to leave this off if we want to have different objects have different thicknesses. Alternatively, we could just decrease the IOR. Of course, doing this isn't exactly realistic, but we're already well outside the bounds of physical reality, so I'm not going to worry about setting this to an accurate value. That's why in this shader, there actually is no IOR control, just a thickness control. But we'll get to that in a second. The other challenge with the glass Bsdf is that you can't see refractive objects through other refractive objects in Eevee. It just goes straight to the next opaque object. So you can see I have this bowl stacked on top of these two trays, and you see straight through the trays right onto the table. With the shader though, you can at least see some of those reflections coming through. And it still has some refraction, as you can see here along the edges. Another benefit is that it comes with transparent shadows. So with the glass Bsdf, you actually don't get transparent shadows no matter what you set the shadow mode to here. And speaking of shadow mode, let's go over all of the settings that we need in order for this to work. First, we need to have backface culling off. If we have that on, and we can look at this bubble shell of a teapot over here. And by the way, this is a really cool scene on Blend Swap by Mzemies. So you can go ahead and download that if you'd like. I'll put the link in the description below. But if we're looking at this teapot, if we turn backface culling on, then all of the parts of the object that are facing away are just going to disappear and we won't get those reflections. So we definitely want those back, so we got to turn this off. Second, the blend mode needs to be alpha hashed and not alpha blend. Alpha blend works fairly well for a lot of simple objects, and you can see here that it's completely noise free. So that works great. But if you have objects that are stacked on top of each other, like these trays, then often the wrong one looks like it's on top. The layering of it is just completely off. You'll notice if I look at it from this angle, the one on the bottom appears to be in front of the one on top. So just set this to alpha hashed. Of course, that's going to introduce some noise, so if you need to clean up your render, you have to go to your render properties and turn up the amount of samples. If it's set to something like 12, you're going to get a noisy render. But if you set it up to 128, of course it will take a little bit more time to render, but you'll get a completely nice and smooth result. As a pro tip, the denoise node in the compositor might help with this situation. But let's go back to our material properties. So we have our blend mode to alpha hashed, and we have our shadow mode as alpha hashed as well. Of course, if we don't set it to that and have it opaque, then we won't get those transparent shadows. Next, we need to have screen space refraction on, of course, in order for refraction to work at all. But we also need to turn it on in the render properties too. So I'm not sure why this is a control in two places, but we need to have it on in the material settings as well as in the render properties, under screen space reflections, and turn on refraction. Then also set the refraction depth to 0, that way we can just control the thickness through the node. And then once you have all those settings in place, then we can go through and look at how the shader is actually working. The main key to understanding it is that there are two different ways to make glass. You can make it with transparency, or you can make it with refraction. Of course, refraction would be ideal in every situation, but of course it has those limitations that we outlined earlier. So here's how you make glass with transparency. I'll hit Shift A, shader, and add a transparent node. Shift A, shader, and glossy, and then we just mix these two together. Shift A, shader, and mix node. And we can look at the result. Let's turn down the roughness here. This looks pretty good, but the reason it's not quite correct is because we also need some Fresnel. So we talked about this in the Fundamentals of Materials and Shading course, and if you know about the principles of PBR, you'll definitely be familiar with it. So let's hit Shift A and go to Input and Fresnel. Plug this into the factor, and there we have our glass. The problem with this though is that the cutoff is really sharp, and I just don't quite like how it looks. And since this is pretty faked anyway, I'm not really concerned about accurate values. I just want it to look good. So instead of using Fresnel, I'll actually use a layer weight node with Shift A, Input, and layer weight. Then I'll use the facing value, which is a much more gradual version. And there we go. Here we have a glass that's completely transparent, and we can see through it, we can see everything on the other side, which is really great. The only problem is that it doesn't have refraction. So we can also do this exact same thing, but just with refractive materials instead. So I'll box select these nodes, hit Shift D, duplicate this down, and switch out the transparent for a refractive shader. I'll hit Shift S because I have Node Wrangler enabled to switch this out to shader and refraction. Then for this one, since the refraction is actually using a correct IOR, I do want to match that with the layer weight. Otherwise we might get some black spots and we don't want that. So I'll go ahead and delete the layer weight and add that Fresnel back in. We just need to make sure that these two IORs match. And once we do that, then we'll have the exact same thing as if we just added a glass node to begin with. If these IOR and roughness values match, then there will be no difference between these two. The trick here is that we can just take these two ways of making glass and mix them together. So I'll take a mix shader here, plug these both in, and look at the result. And there we go. So of course this looks a little bit weird. We'd have to change the IOR down here and mess with a lot of controls. But if we create this into a group node like I've done over here, then we can just have one control on the outside control all of these values on the inside. But this is the basic idea of how this works. And now let me show you the inside of the group node and how it's a little bit more of an advanced version of this. I'll go ahead and delete those nodes except for the material output. Drag this up and let's look at the Eevee glass. By the way, if you're using Blender 2.9, there's a really cool feature where if you go into a group node by hitting Tab, you can actually use the Control Shift preview inside the group node. So I can now look at the transparent glass over here. You can see the results. There's a bunch of inputs here. The first couple nodes are just for making this user-friendly. And then we have our layer weight node, our transparent node, and our glossy node. So nothing special here. Then we also have our refractive glass. I have a bunch of nodes in order for changing the IOR and things like that a little bit more user-friendly. And I've also included some dispersion, which we talked about in the shading course, but you can also look at this video from Grant Wilk on CG Cookie down below that shows you how to make a dispersion shader. So I'm separating the single RGB color into all of the different red, green, and blue components and plugging that into 3 refraction shaders, one for the red channel, one for the green channel, and one for the blue channel. Then I'm adding them back together and then mixing them with a glossy shader based on the Fresnel. This mix shader here just changes the strength of the reflections. So I'm mixing these two together just like so. The one problem that I had with just mixing this with a straight value, for example, if I unplug this right here, is with the transparent shader, you get this kind of double wall effect over any solid object. And that definitely does not look like glass because it just looks like there's air in between these two surfaces without any refraction going on. So what I wanted to do is create an effect where I can find just that outer edge, which is what I've done with these nodes up here. I'll zoom in on them so you can see them more clearly. But you can see I've taken the layer weight and then done a couple operations just to make it a little bit more extreme and more user-friendly to control where exactly this is being placed. I've inverted it and mixed it like so. So we're plugging this into the mix shader so that the edges get some extra refraction. And there we go. So right along the edges, you won't be able to see through it, but it's so subtle that it actually works. So it's pretty unfortunate though that we can't actually have refraction on top of refraction, but at least we can see the object somewhat. Now, the only thing that this doesn't have is the transparent shadows. So let me turn those lights back on. So what I've done is I've combined the result of the transparent glass that does have the transparent shadows with the result of both of these combined based on whether or not it's a shadow ray. And once you do that, then you're good to go. I'll go ahead and hit Tab to exit out of this, and let's look at all of the controls for the shader. Most of the time I spent on this was making the controls user-friendly, so let's check out how this node works. First, we have the color here, which predictably changes the color. Not too crazy, but one thing that's interesting is that if you change the color of a regular glass Bsdf, let me just add that back in, and we give it the same color, you'll notice something interesting. It tints not just the refractions, it also tints the reflections. And if you remember from the PBR lesson, that's definitely not accurate because it's not a metal. So we might want a little bit of control over that. So I've added this reflection tint control down here. So by default it's 0, and so it's physically correct glass, but if you want to color it a little bit, that's totally fine. Or you could set it all the way up to 1 if you really want that effect. But you should at least have control over that and not have an incorrect result be the default. Next, I have an alpha hashed color fix because the color works a little bit different for the transparent node when it's alpha hashed versus alpha blend. If you set this to alpha blend, then the color is going to come through a little bit more. If I turn this off, you'll see the transparency actually works. And if I add a transparent node here, this will help us see it. If I make this blue and look at it, then we're all good, as you would expect. However, if we're using alpha hashed, then we'll never get color. It's just going to be somewhere along the grayscale values. So because of that, if you don't want to artificially darken things too much with that grayscale value, you can just turn on the alpha hashed color fix and it'll make the transparent 1. And it'll still tint the refractions though. Under that, we have the reflection brightness, just in case it's too bright. For example, if things are just blinding you a little bit, then you can just turn this down. Or you could even boost it if you want. You could set this to 2 or 1.5 or whatever you'd like. Then we have a roughness control. You can see it doesn't blur the objects in the transparent areas, but it will blur the refractions. For most types of glass though, this is set pretty low, so it shouldn't make too much difference. It's mostly helpful for things like fingerprint smudges and things like that are on the reflections anyway. After that, we have the inner refraction. If we set this all the way to 1, then you'll get a more glass-like material. So in case you want that result, then you can definitely get that. Or you could set it to 0 and get completely transparent. If you mix the two, the problem with that is that you will get sort of a double effect, like double vision effect on any object that you have. If we increase the thickness, which just changes how much things are distorted by the refraction. And let's turn the color off just to make this less confusing. If we set the inner refraction to 0.5 and turn up the thickness, then you'll see both the refracted monkey and the transparent monkey. So that can be kind of confusing. However, if you have this kind of zoomed out and there's a little bit of roughness going on, then you really shouldn't be able to tell the difference. So use this control at your discretion. Unfortunately, we just can't have our cake and eat it too when it comes to transparency versus refraction, but hopefully this balance will allow you to choose whatever is best for your particular material at the time. Now, even if you have this set all the way to 0, you can still use that edge refraction. So with this set to 0, then we get that sort of double wall right on the edge. But as we increase this, we can move that closer and closer to the center. You may have also noticed that there's some dispersion going on, and that's this control down here. We can turn it off completely or get pretty crazy with it. Of course, the thicker your object is, the more that's going to come through. Lastly, there's also a control for the shadow opacity. So if you want the shadow to be, of course, non-transparent at all, you can just set the shadow mode to opaque. But if you want it to be even lighter than what it is by default, then you can just turn this down. Now you can hardly see it. At about this point in the process, I thought I was done with this node. So I wrapped up the tutorial and started editing, and then thought maybe I should check out if anybody else has done stuff on Eevee glass and see if there's anything I could learn from what they did. Well, I found only 2 other glass shaders online that I liked, and they sort of used a similar approach to what I did here, but a little different. So I want to show you those as well, and how I improved this even further. So the first one, and the one that I'd recommend checking out, is the Eevee Advanced Glass Shader on Gumroad. You can get it for free, or you can buy the whiskey glass or the cherry cocktail scene. I got the second one here just to check it out because I thought it looked really cool. And this has some really, really good looking glass in it. Now, the way that he does the absorption and the caustics I wanted to change around a little bit, but just the idea of having absorption in the first place, I realized, ooh, that's super useful. So I implemented it in a very different way, but it gave me the idea to add it to the node. And I want to give credit there, and you can also just grab it for free. So I'd check that out. And also there's a YouTube channel here, CG Vertex, that talks about Blender Eevee Caustics. He also has a Glass 2.0 tutorial, but I think the node that I have covers a lot more edge cases. I would definitely recommend, though, checking out this Blender Eevee Caustics video. And if I play this, you'll see some really cool effects. Now, it's all faked and it has to do with lights in the scene, and some of it has to do with like adding empties and stuff. So I can't really add that to the shader, but I definitely recommend checking out the video if you're interested. I did, however, add caustics to this example scene that I wanted to show off, and that's simply just by taking a couple different spotlights. In this case, I think it's just one here, and shining it right through the transparent shadows and projecting that onto the ground. So I'm being careful to limit the spread of the cone of the spotlight to just where I want the caustics to show up. And then I'm just cranking up the power really, really high. So you can set this to something pretty extreme and then kind of put the spotlight exactly where you want it, and all is good to go. So as long as you're using alpha hashed shadows, then this works pretty well. Unfortunately, in Eevee, you can't really add textures to your lights because nodes don't work with lights, at least quite yet. Another interesting trick here with the light is that you can turn on custom distance and decrease that if you want. I'll set that to 0 and then just hold shift and slowly increase this. And you'll see that at some point, the light will start to hit the floor and then just kind of fade out. So if you don't want it to go too far, then you can just limit how far it goes. And that way it looks like it's more concentrated just right there. And as long as you have the spread angle, something fairly low, so it's not like way outside the object like that, and you turn the blend all the way up, then we should be good to go. The other thing that I've done is turn off specular, and that way it's not actually reflecting in the glass material here. So that's just a bonus tip for anybody who's come this far in the video. And lastly, I want to show you the absorption and how that works. So I added some absorption that's a little bit different from the Eevee glass shader that I mentioned previously. And this one just starts out in the center of whatever object that you have and spreads throughout. So it's a lot more simple to control and less finicky. You can also change the absorption color here. And for a faked effect, it works fairly well. Here's how I've done it. I'll hit tab to enter the group node and I'll zoom out. You can see I changed the layout a little bit. I tried doing these like straight line pipes thing to try to make it a little bit more readable, but I'm not entirely sure if that's really helpful, because if you need to change anything, for example, if I switch out these little node inputs here, switch the order of them, then it gets all out of whack and then you have to redo it. And I'm not really convinced that it makes it more readable or more helpful, but I thought I'd at least give it a try. So here we have what I already showed you before, but then I've also added this absorption section here. All of these nodes here are just making the inputs mapped to user-friendly values, just between 0 and 1. And with the RGB curves, the input value starts off and it climbs very, very fast and then gradually tapers off. If this curve was inverted, then increasing the value from 0 to 1 would start out very, very slow. And then as you get closer to 1, would increase quite a lot. So just having that curve be like that just helps make the user input more intuitive. All right, so let's get into the meat of how this works. So hold Control and Shift and preview these gradient textures. And these 3 gradient textures are really the key. So we have one that's going from the left to the right. We have one that's going from the bottom to the top. And I've just used these mapping nodes to just rotate this into place. So this one's rotated by 90 on all of the different axes. And then here we have one that's going from the front to the back. And this one is mapped just -90 along the Z. So I have some gradient textures. And then I've used a math node with a ping pong. And that's just going to bounce this off to the other side once it hits 0.5. So once it hits that middle value, right in the middle there, then it just goes back to 0 on the other side. And you can see that as you decrease this, you'll start to get that sort of repeating pattern. But if you set this to exactly 0.5, halfway in between the object, then it'll just bounce to the other side. And I'm using generated coordinates so that it doesn't matter what the scale of the object is or whether you've applied scale or not. It should always work on all objects. There's a downside to that, but I'll show you how to fix that in just a second. So here we have the ping pong, and then I've just used a map range node with inputs connected to the outside. So we have these inputs here, the from minimum, that's connected to this map range node and the multiply node, just to make it more user friendly. And then the from maximum, and we can see if I just Control Shift and preview the map range node, then head out of here and change the absorption. This is what the control is actually doing. It's changing the minimum and maximum inputs. And so if I decrease this, it just gets sharper and sharper right towards the middle. And then as I increase it, it just kind of fades out towards the sides. And then when I multiply all of these together, so we multiply those two and then multiply by that one in the middle, then when I hit tab and preview this, you'll see it just starts in the center and just kind of spreads out from there. So this is the effect. Now, one challenge is what material should actually be blended into the glass here. And what I've done is I've created a mixture of diffuse and translucent. As we talked about in the fundamentals of materials and shading course, translucent is sort of the opposite of diffuse in the sense that diffuse, of course, you have the light that's hitting it and then it's darker on the other side. Translucent is darker on the side that's facing the light and lighter on the side that's facing away from the light. So if we mix these together at a value of 0.5, we'll just get a completely flat object. The reason we're doing it like this, though, and not using an emission shader or anything like that, is because it's still respecting the lights. So if we were to change the colors of the lights or anything like that, this would still respond accordingly and change colors correctly. We also can't use subsurface scattering with transparent materials, so it's kind of the only option. So just mix diffuse and translucent at 0.5, and you'll get this exactly flat material. So I'm mixing that in based on this effect with the two things multiplied. And then I'm just taking away the Fresnel because I still want it to be reflective along those grazing angles. So I'm taking the Fresnel, I'm inverting it so it's darker along those glancing angles, then multiplying it. So it's just taking away the white from any of those angles. And then I also have a mix of completely black, just so that as I go more towards 0, it will get completely black. And as I go more towards 1, it'll get completely white. Okay, so then I mix those shaders together, and then that gets plugged into the transparent shadow section. And with all that combined, we can now set an absorption color and make a lot more types of materials. The one thing I didn't mention though is what happens if this absorption is happening in the wrong spot. You can see if I set this to something really strong, like this blue here, it's starting in the middle here, but by default it was actually starting in the wrong space. What I've done is I've changed the texture space in the mesh data properties, but that's only one way to fix the problem. So if we have under here, under the mesh data, the triangle with the 3 vertices, under texture space, if this was auto texture space, which it is by default, you can see it's kind of starting around over here, when I'd really want it to start over kind of in the middle of the turtle's shell. Well, to view the texture space, you can go to the object properties and just turn on texture space under viewport display. There we're going to see that bounding box there. And if we go to our mesh data properties and uncheck auto texture space, then we can shift this along any axes, and then the center of that gradient is going to follow. So if we have our location along the X, we could change it, along the X, and you can see it following there in the viewport. So this is one way of changing that if you'd like. We could center that like only around his head if we want, or whatever. So that's very useful. But if you wanted to do it via nodes, then what you could do is just tab into here. And I didn't want to do this because I didn't want to complicate the node and make it even bigger than it already is. But what we could do is just put a mapping node in between the texture coordinate and these other mapping nodes here. And just shift everything over. Like so. And then Shift A, vector and mapping. Just like so. And then we could change the location, rotation, or scale from here. So we could hold Shift and change the X, change the Y, change the Z. Rotating it won't do a whole lot because it's already fairly symmetrical on all axes, but we could change the scale, and that could help in some situations. So if we really want to concentrate it on one part of the object, then you can do that, and you can just expose this to the node by selecting these vector inputs and just plugging them in here. So if you want to do that for the location, that might be handy. Plug that right into the bottom socket. And then you can change the location. But I found that adding all these vector things just made it overly complicated, and for the most part, using it right in the center works fine. So I've opted not to do that on the node, but you can do that if you'd like, or change the texture space in the mesh data properties. I'll go ahead and get rid of that input, location, and just click the X. And Control X to delete this node here. And now we're back to normal. And with that, that's everything I know about shading glass in Eevee. I hope you learned something new in this tutorial, and if you want to download this node and just use it right away, then you can find that in the link below. I'll either have it on CG Cookie for anybody who's a CG Cookie subscriber under the resources section, or I'll put it on the Blender Market for just a couple bucks and you can download it there. Or alternatively, I'll also just go through all of the nodes here, just so that you can see exactly what's going on, and just copy it one for one if you want. That's not a problem too. So I'll just go through an overview of all of these nodes. And I've tried to label all of the reroute nodes as well so that it's clear what does what. It ended up being a pretty big node tree, but when you break it down into exactly what each section is doing, it's actually fairly simple. And if there was anything in this video that seems like it was a little overcomplicated or I breezed past a little bit too much, I'd recommend checking out the Fundamentals of Materials and Shading course that I just released on cgcookie.com, because that covers a lot of the foundational concepts that went into building something like this. So you'll build a simplified glass shader in that course, and also you'll get an overview of every single shader node and how to use it in Blender, as well as all of the cycles and Eevee settings that you need to switch in order for things to look good. So if you want to check that out, that'll be in the link below as well, and I'll see you on cgcookie.com.